Jennifer from Fiberflux. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make this beautiful fiddlehead shawl. This is a textured, cozy, beautiful shawl for any time of year, and we've added some great texture with alternating V-stitches and puff stitches. So the finished shawl measures about 50 inches long and is about 17 inches wide. So it's a nice, wide, generous shawl. It's perfect for those early days of spring that are chilly, or in the summer when kind of rooms are over air conditioned, and in the winter if you need something cozy, in the fall as the days are cooling off. So it's a really great versatile shawl to have year round. Has a ton of texture. I've done mine in a single color of this pretty shade of green, but feel free to choose variegated yarns, self-striping yarns. They all work very well for this pattern to show off the stitches and the yarn color as well. So let's get started. For this project, you'll need a tapestry needle, a pair of scissors, a 6.5mm K crochet hook. You'll also need a ruler or a tape measure. This is helpful to have while you're working to get the correct length that you need. And your yarn. I'm going to be using Red Heart with Love, and I'm going to be using 2 balls of this in the lettuce. Now, the Red Heart with Love comes in 2 different sizes. These are the larger size balls of this. Each one of these is 370 yards. Now, they make a smaller ball that's 315 yards. I'm going to be using 2 balls of the 370 yard size ball. And again, this color is lettuce. Now, if you need to substitute yarn, just use a similar yardage. Again, each one of these is 370 yards. And look on the yarn label for something that is a 4 or a medium on the yarn weight scale, and also recommends the K 6.5mm crochet hook. Now feel free to change up the colors. I just wanted to make something that was kind of fresh and springy looking. So let's get started. Okay, so to begin our shawl, we're going to put a slip knot on our hook. Wrap the yarn around your fingers to make the loop. Bring the yarn behind the loop, reach in with your hook, bring up the loop, and tighten. Our shawl has a starting chain of 65. However, if you want to make your shawl wider or narrower or change it, in any way, just know that it is a multiple of 6 plus 5. So for the starting chain, you just do 6 plus 6 plus 6 plus 6 plus 6, and then just add 5 to that. So you can really customize it however you like. So once again, we need to make a starting chain of 65. So to make a chain, wrap the yarn around your hook and bring it through the loop. That's 1 chain, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 61, 62, 63, 64, and 65. So here is our starting chain. Our shawl is nice and wide. It's a nice generous size. And you'll want to make your starting chain fairly loose. If you're having trouble, many of you ask me this about your starting chain being too tight. Go up a hook size just for the starting chain, and then for the rest of your shawl, go back down to the K hook. Okay? So let's begin row 1. For row 1, we're going to count the 4th chain from the hook. This loop here on the hook already does not count. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. So in this chain right here, we're going to work a double crochet, chain 2, double crochet. Okay? So to make a double crochet, wrap the yarn around your hook, insert it into the chain, and bring up a loop. You'll have 3 loops on the hook. Wrap yarn around hook, bring it through the first 2 loops. Wrap yarn around hook, bring it through the last 2 loops. Then we're going to chain 1. Then we're going to work another double crochet, all in that same chain. This is going to create a V. Our shawl is a series of V stitches and puff stitches, okay? So then what we're going to do is skip 2 chains, 1, 2, and in the chain after that, we're going to work a puff stitch. So to make a puff stitch, wrap the yarn around the hook, insert it into the chain, and bring up a loop. You'll have 3 loops on the hook. Wrap yarn around the hook one more time, insert it back into the same chain, bring up a loop. You'll have 5 loops on your hook. Wrap yarn around hook one more time and insert it into the chain one more time and bring up a loop. You'll have 7 loops on your hook. Now this is when I like to kind of straighten things up, because what we're going to do is wrap the yarn around the hook and bring it through all 7 loops on your hook, just like that, and then chain 1 to close the stitch. So now we've created a V and a puff. So then what we're going to do is skip 2 chains, 1, 2, and in the chain after that we're going to work a V. So we're going to go V, puff, all the way across. So remember, our V stitch was a double crochet, then a chain 1, and then another double crochet, all in the same chain. Next, we're going to skip 2 chains, 1, 2, and work a puff stitch in the next chain after that. So once again, wrap the yarn around the hook, insert it into the chain, bring up a loop, 3 loops are on the hook. Wrap yarn around hook, reinsert it into the same chain, bring up a loop, 5 loops are on the hook. Wrap yarn around hook, insert it into that chain one last time, bring up a loop, 7 loops are on the hook. Wrap yarn around hook, bring it through all 7 loops. And when you do puff stitches, just go nice and slow, take your time with it, because you're drawing your hook through a lot of loops. Okay, so we are building up our row here. So skip 2 chains and then work another V. Again, that's a double crochet, chain 1, and a double crochet. Skip 2 chains, 1, 2, and then work another puff stitch. So wrap yarn around hook, 3 loops on the hook, wrap yarn around hook, 5 loops on the hook, wrap yarn around hook, 7 loops on the hook. I'm going to get a little bit more yarn here. These center pull balls of yarn are so handy. Okay, so then we're going to wrap yarn around hook for our puff stitch and bring it through all 7 loops. Just kind of wiggle your hook through there to get it through all those loops, and then chain 1 to close the stitch. Skip 2 chains, 1, 2, and in the chain after that work a V stitch once again. If at any time you need to see this a little bit slower, just back up to the beginning of this row. We're going to pick up speed as we move across. Skip 2 chains, in the chain after that work a puff stitch. 3 loops, 5 loops, 7 loops. Whoops, let me back out of there. There we go. Wrap yarn around hook and bring it through all 7 loops. Okay, so round 1, or row 1 rather, was lots of counting of chains. This row is more intuitive. You're just going to see what stitch comes next and work the opposite into it. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that. So for row 2, we're going to chain 3. 1, 2, 3, and turn our work. So for this row, the first thing that you come to is going to be a V stitch. Remember, we worked V stitches, then puff stitches, then V stitches, and so forth. So in each V stitch, you'll work a puff stitch. In each one of these puff stitches that you come to, you're going to work a V stitch, okay? So what we're going to do is right in this chain 1 space, the center of the V, we're going to work a puff stitch. So once again, wrap yarn around hook, insert it into the center of that V, and bring up a loop. 3 loops should be on your hook. Wrap yarn around hook, reinsert it back into the center of the V, bring up a loop, 5 loops will be on your hook. Wrap yarn around hook, insert it back into that V one last time, 7 loops will be on your hook. Wrap yarn around hook, bring it through all 7 loops. Same thing we did before. We're just working it into a different spot of our pattern. Okay, so at the top of that V, you'll have a little puff stitch. Okay, let's move on to the next one. The next one that we come to is a puff stitch. So we're going to work a V stitch into this puff stitch. So once again, work a double crochet. You'll see at the top, before we go any farther, you'll see at the top of the puff stitch, there'll be a little hole. See that where we did that chain 1, it'll create a little hole at the top of the puff stitch. So that's where we're going to work our V into. So work a double crochet into the top of that puff stitch, then a chain 1, and then another double crochet into the top of the puff stitch. So our puff stitches and our V stitches will be stacked as well. So you have your puff stitch, and right on top of that is a V stitch. Okay, so we've come to a V stitch next. So we're going to work a puff stitch into the center of that V, that chain 1 space. So wrap yarn around hook, bring up a loop. You'll have 3 loops on the hook. Yarn around hook, bring up a loop, 5 loops. Wrap yarn around hook, bring up a loop, 7 loops are on the hook. Now I like to give a little tug like that just to get everything nice and neat. And then wrap yarn around hook, bring it through all 7 loops, and then chain 1 to close the stitch. So now we have another V with a puff stitch on top. So we're just going to do this all the way across, working our V's into the puff stitches from the previous row and working puff stitches into the V's from the previous row. Okay, so I just worked a V stitch into the top of my puff stitch, and then we're at a V again, so we're going to work a puff stitch. Another tip for making puff stitches is to try not to work too tightly. That'll make it much, much easier for you to get your hook through all of these loops. Okay, we're going to work a V into the top of this puff. I'm just going to pull a little bit more yarn here. Because of our larger K hook and this yarn, this shawl works up rather quickly. Okay, we're at a V again, so we're going to work a puff into that V. And we're just going to be doing this all the way across. Okay, we're at a puff stitch, so go ahead and the top of that stitch at the top of there, work your V, double crochet, chain 1, and a double crochet. Now we've come to another V stitch, so work your puff stitch, 3 loops, 5 loops, 7 loops. Bring it through all 7 loops, chain 1. We're at a puff stitch, so work a V, double crochet, chain 1, and a double crochet. Starting to shape up, we're getting some really nice texture. And the puff stitch itself and the V stitch itself are not very hard stitches to make, but it does make for a nice intricate textured piece that looks more complicated than it really is. Okay, work a V stitch into that puff stitch. This is nice too because you can memorize it pretty quickly. You'll know exactly what you need to do in each stitch that you come to. Okay, I'm at a V stitch, so I'm working a puff stitch into that V stitch. Okay, and then the puff stitch, we're going to work a V into the top of that. And then this V stitch here, we're going to work a puff stitch into that. If you've never made puff stitches before or V stitches, this is a great pattern to practice on as well. Okay, we're at a puff stitch, work our V, and we're almost to the end of the row already. Okay, getting there. This is a V stitch, so we're going to work a puff stitch into that. And the puff stitch here, we'll work a V stitch into that. Double crochet, chain 1 and a double crochet. Here is our puff stitch. Next, because we've arrived at a V stitch, so we're working that puff stitch right into that. We're at another puff stitch, so work a V into that puff. See, as you can see, it's pretty intuitive as to what you do next. Okay, so we're at the last V of the row. So go ahead and work a puff stitch into that last V that you come to. And then to finish off the row, remember this turning chain that we made? In that turning chain space, work a double crochet to finish off the row. Okay, so row 2 is complete. It's looking very, very nice. Okay, the last row that I'm going to show you, row 3, is basically the exact opposite of what we just did. So go ahead and chain 3, 1, 2, 3, and turn your work. So in the last row, we had if we look here, we worked a puff. So we have a puff stitch as the first one of our row. So whenever you come to a puff, you work a V. Okay, so work a V stitch right into that first puff stitch. Again, that's double crochet, chain 1, double crochet. The next one we come to is a V stitch. So we're going to work a puff stitch into our V stitches. And we're just going to be doing this all the way across. It's basically the same exact thing we did before, except we just started on a different stitch. That's the only difference. All right, so let's work across this row, and then we're basically going to be repeating rows 2 and 3 for the entire pattern. So let's work through this row, and then we can just simply repeat rows 2 and 3 for the remainder of our shawl. Once again, I'm making a puff stitch into the V, a V stitch into the puff. Now this also looks really nice if you switch up the colors. I wanted to do something green and kind of spring-like, but this is really pretty also worked in some different colors just because of the stitches that you're working down into. Now sometimes your yarn, when you work a puff stitch, might split a little bit. So when that happens, do what I did, just kind of pull it apart and redo it. Just like that. It happens sometimes because when a lot of yarn is made, they twist up plies. So sometimes when you're running a hook through it or a needle, you can go in between one of those plies and kind of unravel it a little bit. Okay, working a puff stitch next. Okay, we're moving right along, working our stitches, our puff stitches and our V stitches. Now, this is a good example. See how this loop looks kind of loose? Doesn't look very nice. So like I mentioned before, if you make a puff stitch and you just don't like the way it looks, just pull it apart and redo it. There's a lot of loops happening here, so it's bound to happen at some point. When I was learning how to make puff stitches, I think I pulled out just as many as I created. So just know that, you know, you can always go back with any of your projects and redo something if you don't like the way it turned out. Okay, so once again, we're working our puff stitches into our V's and our V's into our puffs. And I'm just a little more than halfway through row 3. And again, if you need to see any of this a little bit slower like we did in rows 1 and 2, just kind of back up and watch the stitches again. And once you get the hang of it and memorize the sequence and the pattern, this shawl works up very quickly and it makes a great gift as well. Shawls and scarves and things like that always make really nice gifts because you don't really have to know what size the recipient is going to be. And, you know, so you don't have to measure them or anything like that. And you don't have to, you know, you don't have to size it, but you also can allow them, it gives them the flexibility to kind of style it however they want. So for me personally, I like to wear shawls asymmetrically. Some people like to wear them more traditionally. Some people like to wear them as a scarf and kind of tie them up or wrap them like a cowl, like wrap them a bunch of times tightly around the neck. So it's a very flexible and beautiful gift. And if you have a lot of yarn sitting around that's a similar weight, it's also a great way to get rid of a lot of yarn too. You could make a striped shawl as well. Okay, so we're coming up to the end of row 3. I just wanted to show you that row because it's just kind of the opposite of what we did for row 2. Okay, so we're at the very last stitch, and which happens to be a puff stitch. So we're just going to work that V stitch. Again, that's a double crochet, chain 1, and a double crochet. And once again, when you get to that turning chain space right there, work just 1 double crochet to finish off the row. Okay, so row 3 is complete. It looks really nice. It has some really fun texture happening. And for the remainder of your shawl, you're just going to be repeating rows 2 and 3, 2 and 3, 2 and 3, over and over and over until your shawl is as long as you like it to be, or until you run out of yarn. If you have lots of yarn and you don't really know when to stop, a good rule of thumb is to make your shawl go from hip to hip or kind of like the thigh to thigh. So you go all the way around from one leg or hip, go all the way around and up around the back of the neck and back down. So that's kind of a good rule of thumb. It'll give you lots of coverage. This is going to be nice and wide, so we'll give you lots of shoulder coverage as well. So I'm going to keep repeating rows 2 and 3 over and over and over. Once we get towards the end of our shawl, we will rejoin and I'll show you how to kind of finish everything off and to weave in the ends, etc. So keep repeating rows 2 and 3 and we'll rejoin in just a bit. So I'm just coming up to the end of the last row and we've been repeating our sequence over and over and over, and our shawl looks beautiful. So when you're finished and you get that very last row done, I just worked that, again, that double crochet and that turning chain. What we're going to do now is grab our scissors and you can just cut the yarn. The finishing on this is super easy. Pull that through and then you'll have a little tail. So any tails that you had from joining a new ball of yarn or changing colors, etc. Now I kept mine very monochromatic. But, you know, any tails that you may have, and then you may have to give that a fresh cut. I kind of pulled it apart a little bit, but get those ends woven in. I'm just going to thread my tapestry needle. Move my hook over here. So what we want to do is just go in all those loops with our tapestry needle. And if you have different colors, now mine is all one color, but if you have different colors, just try to keep your tail in the same color as the area that you're weaving it into. And you can go in one direction, come back in the other direction, just like that, okay? Now grab your scissors. Coming back in the other direction, for me, helps to lock that tail into place. It holds it in there a little bit nicer. And then you can just snip that off. So our Fiddlehead shawl is complete and it looks absolutely beautiful. It has great texture and it has a little bit of openness to keep it lighter for springtime, and sometimes those early days of spring can be a little chilly. So this is a wonderful piece to have on hand, and you can take this all the way through the fall and into winter as well. So it's a very versatile piece. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks so much for watching, and be sure and click the subscribe button to get all the latest Fiberflux video updates. Thanks again!